Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Justin Haskins Show. Thank you for joining me. My name is Justin Haskins. Today, we're going to be talking about stunning poll results. Absolutely stunning poll results. Shocking, horrifying poll results. Mind-blowing stuff. I promise you, your mind is going to be blown. Stick with me in this episode of the Justin Haskins Show. But before we get into these poll results, a quick call to action. Please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment on iTunes if you're listening to the audio version, on YouTube if you're watching the video version of the show, or on any of the podcasting platforms where this show appears. All of these things are going to help break through big tech algorithms that hold content like this back. Doesn't cost any money, just a little bit of your time. Please like the video, subscribe, and leave a comment. It would be greatly appreciated. All right, let's get to today's topic. It is a stunning one. Before we get into the poll results themselves, let me set the stage a little bit. I work for the Heartland Institute. It's a free market think tank, a national free market think tank. We work in all 50 states. We work overseas now, actually, in Europe, and we work in Washington, D.C. So we're all over the place, fighting for liberty, fighting for freedom. And one of the things that I've done at the Heartland Institute over the past 5 years, maybe even more, is conduct polls with Rasmussen reports. I write polls, Rasmussen reports does the polling, and then we co-publish the results together. And the things that we found in these surveys have been incredible stuff. We found so many amazing things in the surveys that I've conducted with Rasmussen. They're incredible people over there. Great pollsters. Couldn't say nicer things about the people at Rasmussen Reports. But this particular poll is one of the most shocking that we've ever done. What I wanted to do was write a poll that was designed specifically for 18 to 39-year-olds, likely voters, national survey, and wanted to find out what 18 to 39-year-olds think about socialism and socialist politicians and socialist policies and socialist authoritarianism type stuff. And as you'll see, it's incredible what we found. Incredible. Whatever you're imagining the results to be, they're probably a lot worse. They're probably a lot worse. And it's really disturbing. And the reason why we wanted to do this was to find out not just what the support for socialism and authoritarianism is among younger people, but also try to see if we could tease out why socialism and some of these authoritarian policies are so popular. What's going on in young people's lives to make them support socialism and socialist and authoritarian policies? Not all of the authoritarian stuff is necessarily socialist, although I think the two typically go hand in hand, to be honest. And so we did find some answers to those questions as well. And we're going to get into the kind of the motivations that we think a lot of young people have for being attracted to socialism. But that was the goal of the survey. And so we asked, oh boy, I don't know how many questions, somewhere around 20 or more questions to over 1,000 respondents. And as I said, the results, incredible. So let's just jump into it so that you can see for yourself exactly what I am talking about. This is not the full survey, this part that I'm about to show you right now. This is just the survey results that have been released so far to the public. I'm actually posting this video and the podcast version of the show before the full survey results have gone out and been made public. Because the way we do surveys is we conduct one gigantic survey and then we publish it in usually 3 or 4 parts. So this is just the first part, and I'll give you parts 2 and 3 in our Excel sheet because we don't have the published results out yet. They haven't been made public. All right. So the big headline here, Heartland Rasmussen poll. This is on heartland.org. Heartland Rasmussen poll, 53% of young voters want a socialist to win the 2028 presidential election. 76% want government to nationalize major U.S. industries. Let's go straight to the results. We don't need to go through all of the press release stuff. Okay, so as I said, survey of over 1,000. It was actually 1,200 U.S. likely voters, 18 to 39, conducted at the end of August. right off the bat, one of the really interesting things was Trump approval rating among younger voters was actually pretty high. You can see strongly approve or somewhat approve was at 48%. That's a good thing. I think what you're going to find out here pretty soon, though, is that there are a lot of young people that like Trump that are also attracted to socialist policies, which is a really weird thing that's going on the right now. But that seems to be the case in this data and in other data that I've collected in the past as well. So this is the only good news you're going to get from this survey. 48% approval rating for Donald Trump in the survey. All right. This question is kind of an interesting question. 2024 presidential election. Who did you vote for? 45% said Harris, 41% Trump, 7% third party, 6% didn't vote, 1% not sure. These are kind of standard results for what you're looking for when you're doing a national survey. If the primaries were held today, this is the interesting one I was just referring to. If the primaries were held today and the candidates were Kamala Harris, AOC, Bernie Sanders, Gavin Newsom, Zohran Mamdani, who would you vote for? Kamala Harris, believe it or not, number one candidate in here. Thought that was really interesting. Far and away, not even close. I really hope the left actually goes with Kamala Harris because it would be catastrophic. She's one of the most unlikable presidential candidates in history. Terrible choice, but for whatever reason, a lot of people on the left still like her. So 36% of respondents said Kamala Harris, 9% AOC, 16% Bernie Sanders. If you add these two together, which I think you should do, it's 25%, still less than Kamala Harris. You have Gavin Newsom at 9%. That's incredible considering how much media attention he's been getting. 4% for Mamdani, which is pretty good for a guy who's just running for mayor in New York. 6% for someone else, 11% they wouldn't vote, 8% not sure. So the big takeaway is if you add the more sort of establishment candidates, Harris and Newsom together, that's well over 40%. And it seems to suggest that a socialist candidate in the Democratic primary, a hardcore socialist candidate, is probably not going to win. Now, I would argue that Kamala Harris is a socialist, a democratic socialist. I think her policies support that. And that might sound like kind of far right-wing rhetoric or something, but I really do believe the best evidence shows that. She supported AOC's Green New Deal, for example. She co-sponsored it when it was in the Senate, back when she was a senator. And that is as socialistic of a thing as you could possibly get. So I believe Kamala Harris is a full-blown socialist. Gavin Newsom is probably not a socialist. He's a far left-wing progressive, but definitely more establishment, both of them, more establishment than Bernie Sanders or AOC, who are having trouble winning. But as you're going to see, actually, we'll skip ahead a little bit and get to this question down here since this is relevant. Question number 6. The next presidential election is in 2028. Would you like to see a Democratic Socialist candidate win the 2028 presidential election? A Democratic Socialist candidate. This wasn't just asked to Democrats. This was asked to all likely voters, again, 18 to 39. 53% said yes. 27% said no. And 20% said not sure. This is a really stunning result. More than half of young voters say they want a socialist to win the next presidential election. Really crazy. Really, really crazy. Very, very high number. Because remember, a lot of these are Republicans. The number isn't listed here on the screen, but 35% of those who said they voted for Donald Trump in 2024 said that they would vote for wanted to see a Democratic Socialist candidate win the 2028 presidential election. 35%. Again, it's a weird thing going on right now where there's this support for Trump among younger people that's higher than usual for young people, for a Republican candidate. But there's also this socialistic side to a lot of those people who are attracted to Trump. And when you really think about it, it shouldn't be that surprising because, like, Elon Musk, for example, is a Trump supporter, or at least he was until the whole blow up happened in Washington. Elon Musk was a Trump supporter, right? But he was also a Barack Obama guy. Joe Rogan was a Trump supporter. Well, yeah, but Joe Rogan was also a Bernie Sanders guy. There were a lot of left-wing people that sort of felt like they wanted to support left-wing policies, but they really hate the establishment and they wanted to vote for the anti-establishment candidate. And Trump is the anti-establishment candidate. And I think that's why there's 35% of young people who voted for Trump say that they want to vote for a Democratic Socialist candidate in 2028. So really disturbing stuff. Okay. Do you believe the United States is a fundamentally good or evil or morally mixed country? Only 28% said fundamentally good, 17% said fundamentally evil, 50% said mixed. Not the worst, craziest result. I think a lot of people would say mixed makes sense. Do you agree or disagree with this statement? This is a shocking one. Major industries like healthcare, energy, and big tech should be nationalized. Nationalized means taken over by the federal government to give more control and equity, a buzzword for socialist, to the people. 39% said strongly agree. 37% said somewhat agree. If you add those two together, it's over 3/4. So more than 3/4 of respondents, including more than 70% of young Republicans, said they strongly or somewhat agree that major U.S. industries should be nationalized, taken over by the government to give more control and equity to people. This is a stunning result. It's absolutely stunning. Absolutely stunning. Okay, so we asked about support for a socialist presidential candidate. 53% said yes. So then we asked, of those 53% who said yes, among the following options, which best describes the biggest reason you would like to see a Democratic Socialist candidate win the 2028 presidential election? And the results, we gave them a bunch of different options. The number one result by far was 31% said, it was plurality, housing costs are too high. This was the number one reason why they said they want a Democratic Socialist. The number two reason was the economy unfairly benefits older, wealthier Americans, which is something that is very similar to the housing costs are too high, because older, wealthier Americans have already bought their houses in a lot of cases, and they don't have a problem with housing costs being too high. So you add these two numbers together, you get 48% gave one of these two responses. The next one was 15% said the economy unfairly benefits large corporations. So again, it's an issue of fairness or a feeling like you're not able to dramatically improve your own life because the system is kind of rigged against you. Then the next one down was, let's see, taxes are too low for corporations. Then taxes are too low for wealthy individuals. Only 8% said that they want a Democratic Socialist candidate because they desire to have a single-payer healthcare system, which is really incredible because for a long time, that was the biggest issue in one of the big issues in American politics in general, but it was certainly one of the biggest drivers for support for socialism back in the Obama days and in the Bernie Sanders presidential campaigns. But it's not right now. Right now, it's housing costs are too high. The economy is unfairly benefiting older, wealthier people. The economy is unfairly benefiting corporations. Again, it's about fairness and a feeling from a lot of young people like they really don't have a chance to better their lives because the system is rigged against them. So really, really interesting polling results. But it gets crazier. It gets so much crazier than this. I promised you that we would have mind-blowing results. And what I've shown you so far, I mean, there's been some crazy stuff in there, right? More than 3/4 of voters, including more than 70% of young Republicans, say they want to nationalize major industries. That's crazy. More than half of young voters want a socialist to be president in 2028, including 35% of Trump voters. That's pretty crazy. Again, we're talking young Trump voters. That's nuts. But it does get crazier. It actually gets a lot crazier. So I'm gonna pull up a file here in just a second, but that gives the other polling results. But the reality is, like, when you look at these questions, I get the sense from talking to a lot of people right now on the right, that there's this confidence. There's this confidence that didn't exist 2 years ago, or even really a year ago. This feeling that the tides have turned in the favor of conservatism, that there's this movement, younger people are becoming more conservative, and there's this feeling that middle of the road people are there. They voted for Trump, and so Trump won the national popular vote, for the first Republican to do that since George W. Bush. And there's this huge feeling that, things are starting to go in our direction as pro-liberty, free market people. And while I think there is some truth to that, I also believe that it's maybe a little bit misguided to think that because Trump won, that means that conservative ideology is becoming increasingly more popular. I don't think the two things are necessarily the same. Now, that makes it sound like I'm trying to criticize Trump. I'm trying to be critical of Trump. That's not really what I'm trying to do at all. I just think that there are a lot of people who voted for Trump not because they wanted conservative policies, but because they wanted anti-establishment, anti-elites, anti-corruption policies. And Trump presented himself as the outsider that the establishment hated. They hated him so much they were trying to throw him in jail. He literally got shot in the head. He was called a dictator and a Nazi. He was convicted of all these felonies. Many of them were just completely absurd charges. And then he ended up surviving all of that. An assassination attempt, being nearly thrown in jail, the whole establishment being completely opposed to him, the media establishment being completely opposed to him. He survived all of that. And I think there were a lot of people who said, wow, I want that guy. I may not be a conservative or a libertarian or whatever, but I want that guy because he's going to stand up to the establishment and to the elites, and that's what I want. I think that's why RFK Jr. was gaining a lot of popularity before he threw his lot in with Trump. Same idea, right? What do they have in common? RFK Jr. is a leftist, but the reason why he kind of fit with Trump is because he's an anti-establishment leftist. And that is what they had in common. And that's what I think a lot of voters liked about both of those two candidates. And I think ultimately that's why Trump won. And you see this, especially I think that was true with younger people, which is why you're seeing the poll results show that there's a support for socialism even among those who like Trump. Okay, let's get into the really, really crazy stuff. Okay, because it does get crazier here. Okay, so these results haven't been released yet at the time I'm publishing this video, but they will be released soon. And you can find the results at heartland.org if you're interested in looking at that, or you can just Google Rasmussen socialism, Google one of these questions, and you'll be able to find the webpage when they're posted live. Okay, so in the second set of polls questions, we wanted to ask people, we were trying to tease out a little bit of what younger people are thinking and feeling and why they might be drawn to socialism. Is there something going on in their lives that might be causing them to be drawn to socialism? And they say they want a democratic socialist candidate, but what does that mean? How radical do they want the policies to be? These are the kinds of things we're trying to find out in the second and third sets of poll questions. So we asked them, how would you describe your current financial situation? Only 24% of 18 to 39-year-olds said that they're doing well, which I think is a huge, huge reason why socialism is gaining in popularity. Only 24%. So remember, younger people, they don't think they're doing well financially, and they feel like the system is rigged. And so those two things combined, you're going to want a radical transformation of the system. 24% said doing well, 38% said getting by, 29% said struggling, and 7% said in crisis. So more than a third said struggling or in crisis, and 3/4 basically said getting by, struggling, or in crisis. These are not good responses. We asked which best describes your current personal situation. And then we laid out some options. And again, what we're seeing is this was a little bit, the responses for this one were a little more positive than the last one, but still a lot of people who not giving positive results. So 19% said that they're thriving and that their personal relationships are deeply fulfilling. 46%, this was the most popular answer, said they're doing well overall with a few ups and downs. These are both reasonable things to say, right? These are not people who are in crisis. But then 20% said they feel stuck or uncertain about their personal life. 8% said that they feel lonely, disconnected, or emotionally drained. And 5% said that they're in crisis and feel mostly negative about their personal lives. You add all that together, that's a third. A third of young people are saying they feel really bad about the way things are going for them personally. And again, a lot of these same people also are saying that they think the economy is rigged in favor of older people, wealthier people, that they can't afford to buy a home, and that that's a big reason why they support socialism, and that big corporations, the system is set up to benefit them, and that's not fair either. And then they're feeling stuck, uncertain about life. They feel lonely, disconnected, emotionally drained. They feel like they're in crisis. All these things are related, I think. I think it's certainly reasonable to come to that conclusion. Do you think the American economy is unfair to young people? Well, this just gets straight to the point, doesn't it? 62% said yes. 62% said yes, including 48% of Republicans and 63% of independents. 73% of Democrats said that. So they believe huge percentages of Republicans, Democrats, and independents say, yes, the American economy is unfair to young people. Even Republicans say that under a Republican president and a Republican Congress. So lots of young people feel like the system is just not fair. We asked them, how confident are you that you'll own a home at some point in the next 10 years? We can skip that question for the sake of time. All right. So then we started asking some questions that were meant to tease out kind of how radical people are in their policies here, right? So we know that they support socialist presidential candidates, more than half of them, 53%, but how radical are they in terms of their beliefs about economic issues, about social issues, about cultural things going on, freedom issues? And so we started asking a series of questions, and this is where the end of the second survey grouping occurs, and then you get into the third section, which is mostly about these kinds of questions. So the first one we ask is, would you support a law that would confiscate Americans' excess wealth, including things like second homes, luxury cars, and private boats, in order to help young people buy a home for the first time? 55% said they would strongly support or somewhat support this policy. Confiscating people's wealth so that they can buy a home. This is as socialistic of a policy as you'll possibly find. 38% said that somewhat or strongly oppose. 7% said not sure. Which country should be the most powerful country in the world? America, Canada, European country, South or Central American country, et cetera, and then it finishes with the United Nations. 59% said America. Now that was the winner, but 59%, that's it? Young Americans, 59% want America to be the most powerful country in the world. 5% said Canada, 4% said a European country, 2% for South or Central American, 2% for African, 2% for Asian, 11% said they want the United Nations to be the most powerful entity in the world. And there's another question later on, which is much more disturbing than that. 1% said some other country, 15% said not sure, but ultimately only 59%, less than 60% of young Americans say that they want America to be the most powerful country. Wow. All right. That's, totally unbelievable, but it gets worse. It does get worse. It gets a lot worse, actually. Okay. Next question. Would you support a law that imposes a maximum annual income cap for individuals? So we're asking, would you support a law that caps how much money any singular person can make. So again, this is a socialist and progressive policy. If you add up all the yeses, because we provided different income levels where the cap would go into effect, if you add up all the yeses, it is 59%. So 59% of young people say they do want some kind of law that caps an income at a level that is, varies from $100 million down to $100,000. It's pretty incredible that 8% said the cap should be between either less than 200,000 or less. I mean, think about that. $200,000. I mean, it's not that that's bad money. That's good money, but you're not like some crazy rich person if you're making $200,000 a year or $150,000 a year. It depends on where you live, obviously. But I mean, you're not a rich person for making that kind of money. And yet they want to cap income at that, almost 10%. But the overall point is that 59% want some kind of income cap. Here's a really crazy one. Should Americans who refuse to use others' preferred gender pronouns face fines or legal penalties? 17% said yes, a monetary fine. 16% said yes, a mandatory community service penalty for using the wrong preferred gender pronoun. 6% said jail time. So you add those together, you get 40%. 40% said yes, if you don't use the right gender pronoun, you should pay a fine, be forced to do community service, or go to jail, but you should be punished. Obviously, this is against the First Amendment of the Constitution, but apparently 40% of young American voters don't care. Would you support an amendment to the Constitution that would abolish the U.S. Congress and replace it with a National Citizens Assembly selected by lottery? Just get rid of Congress, have a National Citizens Assembly, and let's just pick people randomly. Crazy idea. 39% said strongly support or somewhat support. 43% said somewhat oppose or strongly oppose. And 19% said not sure. 39% is pretty high for blowing up a huge part of the government. This one was I think the most shocking question of them all, and it's the last question in the survey. Would you support a proposal for a new constitutional amendment that would give the United Nations the authority to oversee the Supreme Court? Okay, let's stop for a second. New constitutional amendment that would give the United Nations the authority to oversee the Supreme Court and the presidency to ensure that Americans' rights are being protected. So put the United Nations in charge of the Supreme Court and the president. 27%, more than a quarter, said strongly support. 32% said somewhat support. You add those two together, it's 59% of young likely voters said they would strongly or somewhat support a constitutional amendment to put the United Nations in charge of America, ultimately, the president and Congress specifically. What is going on? This is, if you were feeling positive about America coming into this and the future of America, wow. Incredible results. Huge support for socialism, huge support for authoritarian policies, huge support for a socialist president in 2028, massive levels of support for limiting people's free speech. They want income caps. They want to just confiscate people's wealth so that they can buy other people's houses. There's a lot of people who are struggling, who are young financially. A lot of people who feel lonely and sad and feel like life is just kind of a disappointment. These are all really bad signs. Now, as bad as it is, as bad as these numbers are, what makes them especially disturbing is not that young people today hold these radical views. It's that young people today are going to be the primary voters in the future. the generation, this group of people in 20 years is going to be the bulk of the voters. And so over the next 10 to 20 years, as these people become increasingly more powerful and influential in society, in the economy, in business, in politics, as voters, as a voting bloc, what kind of government are we going to have when even a large chunk of Republicans want these crazy socialist policies? Now, you might be tempted to think, because I've heard this said many times, yeah, but Gen Z, the Zoomers, the younger group within this cohort, as opposed to the millennials who, like me, they are becoming more conservative. So at least it's going in the right direction. Now, I didn't have the time to go through all the results by age group, but we have it broken down in what they call the crosstab section of the data, the polling data. We can tell which age groups, it's like in 5-year chunks or something like that. Maybe it's 4-year chunks. It's something along those lines. We could tell how much support for various questions and socialist candidates and authoritarian policies, each smaller age group within the 18 to 39 group, within the 18 to 39 total number of respondents, we can tell how each individual age group within that, how they responded to these questions. And what we found was that Gen Z is more authoritarian and more socialistic and more supportive of freedom-killing policies and confiscating wealth, and more likely to say that things are bad and unfair than millennials, the older group, which is what you would normally expect when you were looking, say, 20 years ago, comparing millennials to the next generation up. And if you go back 40 years, same thing. Usually when you're looking at young Americans, the younger you are, the more radical you are. And then you get a little bit more moderate as time goes on. But we're seeing that with Gen Z and millennials, just as we've seen it with other generations. So we're not seeing some turn to, conservatism among younger voters. So why do so many people feel like there's all these young people who are becoming conservative? I think the answer to that is because there are a lot of people, I think there are a lot of young conservatives who are much more politically and socially active than they were before. And I think that the young conservatives today are more conservative than the young conservatives were when I was in college, 15 years ago or whatever. I think when millennials were in college, young conservatives were more like Mitt Romney Republicans and George W. Bush types. And I think today, your average young Republican is more in line with like Donald Trump and Charlie Kirk, and they're more conservative on a lot of things. But I think a lot of that is driven by and so I do think there is some truth to younger people are getting more conservative. I just think that it's the young conservatives that are getting more conservative. But young people as a whole, I don't think are getting more conservative. And there are a lot of people who like Donald Trump, who are young, who also like socialist, authoritarian type policies and wealth redistribution and all this crazy stuff. So the trajectory that we're on is not good. We're headed in a very, very, very bad direction if you like, individual liberty and free markets. And that's what this data so clearly illustrates. There's so much more that we could say. And over the coming weeks, I'm going to be doing podcasts and media appearances and all sorts of other things, talking about the polls and breaking down some of the polling data in more detail. But for now, I think we should probably wrap things up. I wish I had better news, but I think what we're seeing, and I know that you might say, well, this is just one poll. Well, yeah, but I've been doing polls for the last 5 years, and I could show you a lot of polls that indicate very similar kinds of things. I think we're headed for very troubling times. Yes, young conservatives are getting more conservative, and I think that there's some good things about that and some bad things about that. I think young liberals are becoming more socialistic than ever before. And there are a lot of people who are kind of in the middle who are maybe not full-blown socialists, but who like a lot of socialist policies. And as this group becomes more important in society, America is going to move further to the left if we don't turn things around soon. So this is something that we need to take really seriously and not get cocky and feel like, oh, well, we're winning elections. Yeah, well, a lot of Republicans are winning elections right now. That's true. But those elections are pretty close. It's not like they're all blowout wins. And the polling data is showing that there's some really disturbing things beneath the surface that we need to pay attention to. Okay, that's enough for today. Thank you for joining me. My name is Justin Haskins. And until next time, please, please, please hate socialism, fight against socialism, don't be a socialist, and stay free.